Hey there, have you ever stopped to think about how much of what you call your personality was actually learned? Maybe you've always considered yourself independent, or the responsible one, or the person everyone can count on. Perhaps you've worn those descriptions for so long they've simply become part of how you see yourself. But what if some of those qualities developed in response to what life required of you? And what if part of becoming is understanding the relationship between who you are and what you've learned to be? Hello, and welcome to the Daring Woman podcast. I'm Dr. Latasha Pinkney, a facilitator of belief transformation. And through my work, I help people better understand and make sense of their experiences so they can move forward with greater clarity, awareness, and intention. Before we get into today's conversation, I just want to point out that we are 4 episodes into this newly rebranded space. And for that, I also want to acknowledge each of you, whether you've been with me since the beginning or you're just finding your way here. Thank you for being here, for supporting these conversations, and for joining me as we continue exploring the experiences, beliefs, and perspectives that shape how we see ourselves and move through the world. And that brings me to today's topic. When we think about personality, most of us assume we're describing something fixed, something that simply reflects who we are. We say things like, that's just how I've always been independent, I've always been responsible, I've always been the one people could count on. And because those descriptions have been with us for so long, we rarely stop to examine where they came from. Instead, we simply accept them as part of who we are. But what if some of the qualities we identify with most strongly developed in response to what life required of us, and we've never stopped to consider how they shaped the way we understand ourselves? What if some of what we call personality was shaped, strengthened, or reinforced through adaptation? That is what I want us to explore today. Because many of the characteristics we value most about ourselves may indeed be authentic expressions of who we are, but some may have developed in response to circumstances, expectations, disappointments, responsibilities, or experiences that required something from us long before we fully understood their influence. And understanding those influences can change how we see ourselves. One of the things I find fascinating about human beings, as if I'm not one, is how quickly we can confuse what we do with who we are. A child who learns to take care of younger siblings may become known as the responsible one. A child who learns to avoid conflict may become known as the peacemaker. A child who discovers that achievement earns praise may become known as the achiever. A child who learns to anticipate everyone's needs may become known as the caretaker. None of these identities emerges in a vacuum. They develop within the context of real lives, real experiences, and real circumstances. I've mentioned before that as children, we are constantly learning. We learn what is expected, what is rewarded, what creates a sense of safety, and what helps us feel like we belong. And often we adapt accordingly. The challenge is that many of these adaptations become so familiar that we stop seeing them as adaptations. We begin to treat them as though they tell the whole story of who we are. Now, I want to be clear that adaptation is not a bad thing. In many ways, adaptation is evidence of resilience. It reflects our ability to respond to the environments we find ourselves in. It helps us navigate challenges. It helps us survive difficult seasons. It helps us function in the world. The question isn't whether adaptation is good or bad. The question is whether we recognize it when we see it. Because if we don't, we may spend years believing that certain patterns, roles, and ways of being represent the totality of who we are, when in reality, they may be only one part of a much larger story. And sometimes life has a way of revealing that distinction. Sometimes a transition, a loss, a relationship, or a significant change forces us to confront questions we never thought to ask. Questions like, who am I when this role changes? Who am I when this responsibility no longer exists? Who am I when the thing that I've always done can no longer define me? For me, one of those moments arrived through motherhood. You'll hear me frame much of what I share through the lens of motherhood simply because of the significant role it has played in my life. On that note, I recently released my book, Still Becoming, faith, identity, and healing when life changes faster than you're ready. What began as me trying to make sense of my evolving role as a mother eventually became a much broader exploration of identity, transition, healing, and the experiences that shape how we understand ourselves. In many ways, the themes we're discussing today are some of the same questions that inspired that book. I've shared in previous discussions that for as long as I can remember, I've always wanted to be a mother. Long before I understood what motherhood would require, it was one of the roles I imagined for myself. And over time, that desire became reality. And like many women, I poured myself fully into it. Motherhood shaped nearly every area of my life. It influenced my priorities, my decisions, the way I spent my time, and the responsibilities I carried each day. It became one of the most meaningful roles in my life. What I didn't fully appreciate at the time was how easily a role can become so central that it overshadows other parts of who we are. There's nothing unhealthy about loving a role that matters deeply to you. Some roles are sacred. Some roles shape us in beautiful ways. The challenge arises when a role begins to carry more weight than it was ever intended to. When my oldest son left for college, I expected the transition to be emotional. After all, this was a moment I had been preparing for his entire life. As parents, that is what we're doing from the very beginning, right? We're spending years teaching, guiding, encouraging, and preparing our children to eventually step into lives of their own. Intellectually, I understood that. Emotionally, however, I wasn't prepared for what that transition would reveal. What surprised me wasn't simply how much I missed him. What surprised me were the questions that surfaced afterward, questions about who I was beyond a role that had shaped so much of my daily life, questions about what I wanted this next season to look like, questions about parts of myself I hadn't thought about in a very long time. That experience forced me to recognize something important. While motherhood was a significant part of who I was, it was not the whole of who I was, and those are two very different things. I suspect many of us encounter moments like that throughout our lives, moments that invite us to reconsider how we've come to understand ourselves, moments that cause us to look beyond the roles, responsibilities, and expectations that have occupied so much of our attention, moments that lead us to ask, who am I beyond this role? What parts of myself have been waiting quietly in the background? What possibilities have I overlooked because my attention has been focused elsewhere? Sometimes, if we're being honest, those moments feel like loss, but sometimes they are invitations. Invitations to rediscover parts of ourselves that have been overshadowed by the demands of a particular season. Another place I began to see how adaptation can shape our understanding of identity was in the way I understood independence. For much of my life, I viewed independence as a strength. It was tied to how I understood responsibility, resilience, and adulthood. And somewhere along the way, I came to believe that handling things on my own was simply what strong people did. I knew how to figure things out. I knew how to keep going. I knew how to take care of what needed my attention, even when I was tired, overwhelmed, or unsure of what to do next. And to some degree, that was a gift. I grew up watching women who knew how to survive. My grandmother and my mother both carried responsibility in ways that shaped my understanding of what strength looked like. As single women, they did not have the luxury of falling apart every time life became difficult. They made decisions, took care of children, handled what needed to be handled, and kept moving forward. Growing up around women like that teaches you something about perseverance and responsibility. It teaches you that life may not always be easy, but you still have to find a way forward. And those lessons served me well. But there's another side to that kind of formation. When strength is modeled primarily through endurance, it can become easy to believe that needing help is a weakness. When responsibility is modeled through carrying everything, it can become easy to believe that love means over functioning. When survival is modeled through self-sufficiency, it can become easy to believe that depending on others is unsafe. And that is where independence can slowly become something more than independence. It can become armor. For me, this showed up in the way I moved through relationships, and especially in marriage. Marriage has a way of revealing things we may not have fully recognized about ourselves, not because marriage necessarily creates those patterns, but because close relationships often expose what has been operating beneath the surface all along. I was comfortable being the person others could depend on. I was comfortable carrying responsibility and handling what needed my attention. What proved more difficult was learning how to let someone else carry some of that weight alongside me. I had spent so much of my life functioning from a place of self reliance that partnership sometimes felt unfamiliar. Allowing someone else to help support or even carry part of a burden required a level of trust that did not come naturally to me. But the challenge wasn't only learning to share responsibility, it was also learning to be vulnerable, allowing someone else to see the places where I was tired, uncertain, afraid, or in need. And that was much harder, not because I did not want closeness, but because self sufficiency had become deeply connected to how I understood strength. And this is where adaptation and identity can become difficult to separate. We say, I've always been this way, or that's just who I am. But sometimes how I am is really how I learned to survive. That does not mean the adaptation was wrong. It just means it deserves to be understood because the very thing that helps us endure one season can begin limiting us in another. What I had not fully considered was how closely my understanding of strength had become connected to self sufficiency. When it became difficult to receive help, to ask for support, and to allow someone else to share the weight, I had to examine whether what I call strength was still serving connection. And I think many of us have some version of that. For some people, it may be hyper independence. For others, it may show up in the need to keep everyone happy, to avoid conflict, to always be dependable, or to rarely express need. Whatever the pattern is, the question becomes how much of how much of this reflects who I am and how much was shaped by what life required from me. If you've ever begun recognizing some of these patterns in your own life, you may also understand why these types of conversations can feel uncomfortable. Because once we start examining the ways we've adapted, another question naturally flows. If this isn't all of who I am, why is it so difficult to let go of these ways of being? And part of the answer is surprisingly simple, and it's because many of these patterns worked. They helped us navigate circumstances that required something from us. They helped us solve problems, create stability, and make sense of situations that might otherwise have felt overwhelming. A child who discovers that responsibility creates stability may become exceptionally dependable. A child who learns that self sufficiency reduces disappointment may become fiercely independent. A child who becomes highly attuned to others' needs may learn to maintain connections by keeping everyone around them comfortable. Within the environments where those patterns developed, those responses often make perfect sense. They are the ways people adapt and learn to navigate the realities in front of them. They reflect a person's ability to respond to the circumstances they were facing with the resources, understanding, and support available to them at that time. The challenge is that life continues to change. The realities that once required us to adapt in certain ways are not always the same realities we continue to face. And yet, many of us continue to operate from beliefs, assumptions, and patterns formed years, sometimes decades earlier. Throughout this podcast, we've talked often about the relationship between experiences, beliefs, and identity. The reason this matters is because experiences rarely end with the experience itself. They influence the beliefs we develop, and those beliefs shape the lens through which we see ourselves, other people, and the world around us. And over time, those beliefs can become so familiar that we stop recognizing them as beliefs at all. They begin to feel like facts. We no longer say, "This is something I learned." We say, "This is just who I am." The shift is subtle, but it matters. Because when an adaptation becomes intertwined with identity, questioning it can feel threatening. It can feel as though we are questioning ourselves. If independence has become part of how you define strength, allowing yourself to need help may feel uncomfortable. If achievement has become connected to worth, slowing down may feel irresponsible. If caretaking has become tied to love, establishing boundaries may feel selfish. If being needed has become connected to purpose, change may feel unsettling. This is one of the reasons growth is rarely as simple as deciding to do something differently. Growth often requires us to examine the beliefs that make certain patterns feel necessary in the first place. It asks us to look beneath behavior and consider what has been driving it, not so that we can judge ourselves or criticize the ways we've learned to survive, but so that we can understand ourselves more fully. Because many of these adaptations deserve compassion. At one point, they may have been exactly what we needed. They helped us navigate difficult circumstances. They helped us endure uncertainty. They helped us continue moving forward. The question is not whether they were valuable. The question is whether they still belong in the same position they once occupied. Now, it's important to recognize that not every adaptation needs to be released. Some continue to serve an important purpose, while others may no longer need to occupy the same place they once did, making room for new ways of living, relating, and understanding ourselves. Which brings us back to the question at the heart of today's conversation. If some of what we call personality was shaped by adaptation, if some of the roles and patterns we've carried were formed in response to what life required of us, then where should our understanding of identity ultimately come from? One of the things I appreciate about the biblical account of creation in Genesis is that it establishes something important about identity. Human beings are created in the image of God before they accomplish anything, produce anything, or prove anything. Their value is not something they earn, it is something they possess from the very beginning. I think that perspective matters because life teaches us to define ourselves in many different ways. We learn from our families, we are shaped by our experiences, we carry responsibilities, navigate disappointments, celebrate successes, and develop beliefs about ourselves and the world around us. All of those things become part of our story, but they do not fully answer the question of identity. For those of us who hold a faith perspective, the deepest truth about our identity is that we are created by God and bear his image. Again, as I stated before, this truth does not diminish the significance of our experiences. Rather, it provides a foundation from which to understand them. Life shapes us in profound ways. We are influenced by the people around us, the responsibilities we carry, the disappointments we endure, and the experiences that become part of our story. But our worth is not determined by what we have endured, what we have achieved, or the roles we have carried. Those things help explain our story, but they are not the deepest source of our identity. So, as we close today's conversation, I want to leave you with a few questions to consider. What qualities have you accepted as permanent parts of your personality without ever asking where they came from? What roles have become so familiar that you struggle to imagine yourself apart from them? What adaptations once helped you navigate life that may now deserve a closer look? And what might change if you approach those parts of yourself with curiosity instead of judgment? Perhaps the work of understanding ourselves isn't about becoming someone entirely new. Perhaps it is learning to understand the relationship between who you are and what you've learned to be. Perhaps some of what you call personality carries a history of adaptation and protection that you've never fully explored. Perhaps some of the roles you've carried have become so central that you've lost sight of the other parts of who you are. And perhaps the invitation is not to reject those parts of yourself, but to understand them with compassion, gratitude, and honesty. Because every adaptation has a story, every pattern has a history, and every person is more than the roles they have carried. Thank you for joining me today. Again, if these conversations resonate with you in any way, I'd love to hear your thoughts. So please comment below and be sure to like and share so that these conversations can reach others who may need them. But until next time, keep reflecting, keep growing, and remember that sometimes the most powerful shifts in perspective begin with a single question.